Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Dr. Feist here at St. Paul University, and I'm engaging with Prichard's 1912 paper, a seminal paper in Ethics in the 20th Century. Does moral philosophy rest on a mistake? This is part 8. So building on the previous videos, I now turn to Prichard's positive assessment. He's basically critiqued the philosophical tradition's answers to the question, what justifies moral obligation? He's gone through a bunch of things. Check those previous videos out if you're not familiar with Prichard's work. But what I'm going to pick up today is more of getting towards his positive response. Like, what exactly is the answer to this, not this particular question, but how do we ground morality? How do we ground obligation? All right, so now we naturally think, and Prichard calls this natural thinking a non-reflective consciousness. That's going to be very important for him, because that's the solution to the foundations of morality, and essentially what moral philosophy is will be found in this non-reflective consciousness. So we naturally think, or in our non-reflective consciousness, that we ought to be moral. This is just something that he thinks is part and parcel of us as a human being when we are sensitized through education and development. We're not born with this. This is something that we do acquire, but it's important nonetheless. And we want Aristotle, though. When we turn to writers of the tradition, we want them, like Aristotle, Prichard points out, to show this. In other words, prove that we should be moral. Like, okay, are our obligations really true? Are they really there? Why do we feel this? Well, because we also, when we encounter our obligations, Prichard says, we also have, after that encounter, we start to doubt them because they conflict, as he points out, with our desires, right? Oh, I should do this, but I don't really want to. That's not fun, or my desire to do something else conflicts with my obligation. So these doubts arise. Now the point is in this ordinary non-reflective consciousness, the recognition that we ought to be moral, that comes first, doubt comes later. That's very important for Prichard, so keep that in mind. So we ask Aristotle to justify, to support it. He doesn't. All Aristotle does is tell us that the happy life, and you want that, right? That's how he begins the Nicomachean Ethics. Standard, off-the-rack, eudaimonistic ethical thought that what is the goal of human life? It is to be happy. That's what we all want. Go talk to everybody. Ask them what they want to be happy. Do they want to be happy for the sake of something further? No. They want to be happy in and of itself, and they want other things like yachts and money and power and prestige and all the other trappings that you can imagine. Those are in order to lead to happiness, not happiness to lead to that. So it's stuff to get to happiness, not happiness to get to stuff. So, in other words, all you're getting is the happy life is the virtuous life. So you don't get any oughts. Aristotle doesn't talk like that. You can read the Nicomachean Ethics. He doesn't really talk about what you ought to do. He talks about doing noble things, and that's fine. But he doesn't really tell you what you ought to do. Basically, he gives us motivation. And Prichard goes on and says, well, if I'm right about all my criticisms, all that this kind of framework can do is really just clarify the details of obligations. Clarify, not justify. Clarify details. Tell us how to improve ourselves. Yeah, that's the goal of life, is you improve yourself, and by these improvements, you're developing your virtues, and by developing your virtues, you'll have a happy life. That's pretty well all Aristotle is saying. But he won't really ground obligation like why you ought to. And again, if you say, why should I be happy? Aristotle will look at you in a very puzzled manner. Like, what do you mean, why should I want to be happy? That's what we want. We all want to be happy. Now, this demand for proof, all this, he's saying the demand itself, that is, Prichard is saying the demand is illegitimate. So, one of the things that we should keep in mind is not every question that can be posed is in fact a sensible question. Not every question that can be posed will have an answer. Sometimes questions are simply illegitimate. So this has been long recognized in philosophy, goes back centuries. Hume was big on this. Learn how to ask the right questions. When you're asking wrong questions, you're off down rabbit holes. So ask the right questions. And as Prichard would say, this asking for this justification is a problem. It's illegitimate. It's not a failing. Don't blame Aristotle. Maybe Aristotle was smart to avoid that. So, with this in mind, Prichard says, okay, now is there moral philosophy? Right? In the strict sense of like moral philosophy deals with obligations. If we can't justify it, what exactly is left of moral philosophy? Maybe there's just virtue stuff. There's just virtue ethics. That's all you can talk about. And remember, as Prichard tried to argue, and I talked about this in a previous video, that virtue and obligation, so virtue and moral philosophy, are two different stories that we want to tell. Well, if it's moral philosophy, then if it is something, what is it? Well, Prichard shifts gears here. He starts to talk about the epistemology of mathematics. And if you recall at the beginning of the paper, he did want to say that one of the main problems in moral philosophy was analogous to one in epistemology. It's asking certain illegitimate questions. So there's illegitimate questions that you can ask in epistemology, and there's illegitimate questions that you can ask in moral philosophy, and so there is a correlation between the two, an analogy. So that's the theme that runs through this paper, is that there are certain things we've learned in epistemology not to do, and so we should take that knowledge or that experience or that lesson from epistemology and transport it into moral philosophy. There are certain questions we should learn not to ask, certain things we should learn not to do. Now, back to the epistemology of mathematics. Prichard says, look, consider 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. First off, you definitely come to learn this, so it's not something that's innate. So, not innate. You're not born with this. He's not making any claims like that. However, what he says is that you come to learn it in school. You know, you count trucks, and then eventually, after counting trucks and cars, counting blocks, counting concrete things, you become a little bit more sophisticated. You start counting more abstract things, like you start counting sleeps before Christmas, right? So children start making more abstract moves until eventually they can handle a mathematical proposition like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, and they no longer think of trucks, cars, blocks, days till Christmas, sleeps, all that stuff. They fully have an abstract appreciation of this as a fundamental truth. In other words, you get to the point, sensitized through your education, that you simply can look at 2 plus 2 and look at 4 and recognize that they're the same thing. In other words, 2 plus 2 and 4, you just eventually can see, yeah, those are the same thing. You come to that point. You're not born with it, you learn, but then eventually you make that kind of leap to recognize that this becomes something that you just immediately see the truth of. That's important. Now, when you come to see the immediate truth of this, it is always the case, certainly, that we make lots of errors all the time, and we recognize that we make errors all the time, and so doubt starts creeping in. Doubt creeps in after you recognize things like this, but your experience with doubt and failure all over the place leads you to start doubting this. So you move from one of an immediate recognition of the truth, you start to wobble, you start to shift, you start to think, well, maybe I'm wrong about this. So as you start to shift away from this, Prichard says, you start looking for some kind of proof. Okay, how do I know that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? So eventually, you move from immediate awareness to a need for proof. So, how do I know for sure that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? I'm starting to doubt this. And as you move away and you start to doubt this, you start to look for some kind of criterion, right? Some kind of quality or criterion that you want. And this search, so this search for a criterion that shows, that says, yeah, if you got that criterion in place, you're going to know that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, and you can be sure of it. So it's after you move from an immediate awareness to a need to a proof, then you search for a criterion, and also not only a criterion, let's say call it Q, we search for a criterion and an application process. So how to apply the criterion. So you're looking for the criterion, an application process. We could call it, let's say, Q. Let's call it this. Q app. So you're looking for a criterion and then a process for applying that criterion to justify that, yes, indeed, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. Got it. Prichard says this is all a mistake. This is all gone wrong. Descartes, he says, launched something like this. With the search for how do you know certain things, I need clear and distinct ideas. This is complicating things. This is when thought is starting to go awry. So clear and distinct perceptions are now classified as knowledge. Now, we don't need that. This generates problems. It generates a couple of problems. Prichard thinks that this search for the criterion Q and application, this gives rise to two problems. All right? So by moving, we started off, we had certainty, we moved to this need for a proof, doubt creeps in, we look for a criterion, we get a couple of problems out of the deal. What are those problems? The first one is a regress problem, and the second one is a confusion. Now, I'm being uncritical here, that is, with respect to Prichard. I'm just trying to bring out what he's after here. There are certainly some questionable things going on. But in any case, let's try and understand Prichard before we criticize him in any way. So, this process of trying to dig in and find a criterion and its application leads to a regress. And what does Prichard mean by that? Well, he pulls back a bit and offers something general. He says, look, to really know that A is equal to B, okay, something, 2 plus 2 is 4 or 6 plus 3 is 9. To know, basic arithmetic propositions. And there are lots of these propositions that we know. Limited in terms of the universe of propositions, but there are some that we immediately know. But he says if you don't take them as immediate knowledge, you'd say to really know that A is equal to B, we must first know that we know, that it is the case, that it is a fact that we know that A is equal to B. In other words, let's call this F. F will stand for that we know that A is equal to B. Well, we now got the regresses started. To really know that A is equal to B, we have to know this fact, F. Well, you could say the same thing now. In order to really know that F is the case, we must first know that we know that F. Well, we'll call that G. Well, and really know that G is the case, and you can see how this just keeps going on. You can just keep iterating this. Once you've got one iteration set up, Prichard said the rest follow, and you've got an infinite series, if you like. How do we block this? Well, Prichard says you block this simply by saying there are things that we just know. There is a sense, there is it's complete that it is the case that there is immediate knowledge. That's how we block this whole regress argument. So this generates a problem. We get a regress. No, we have to go back to there are things that we just know. We have to go back to here. That there is some sense of immediate awareness. And by moving from that immediate awareness, that raised the proof, and then we got into that, and then we get into the wrong. This is all wrong. That's the first problem, is the regress. The second problem is a confusion. We started off, remember when I talked about the move here? Prichard says there's a move. You really are in this kind of mental state. You know that 7 times 4 is 28. another arithmetic proposition. And you were in that initial immediate awareness of the truth of that, right? After your learning process, you come to that immediate awareness, right, in your non-reflective consciousness that 2 plus 2 is 4, 7 times 4 is 28. That's your real state, so to speak, where you grasped it. So the grasping was an act of knowledge. That's knowledge. That's positive knowledge. You know that 7 times 4 is 28. Now, what happens? And it's sort of what's going on here. There's a move, there's a shift, a move from to. And when you move from this immediate awareness to a need for a proof, what Prichard thinks is going on here is that you've moved from this real state of knowledge that 7 times 4 is equal to 28, now to a state of belief. And you can doubt your beliefs. That's easy. Any belief you have, you can doubt, right? If I believe that I'm here right now, I could doubt it. Easy. I could doubt anything that I just believe. That's what beliefs basically are. They are doubtable. They could be wrong. Prichard is picking up, at the risk of doing a little bit of criticism here, Prichard is picking up a very old view of knowledge, namely that knowledge, when you really have it, it's incorrigible. It can't be wrong. So when you're in this real state here, and 7 times 4 is 28, you know it. It's not something that you can seriously doubt. And once you realize, says Prichard, that this grasping of these kinds of truths is an immediate awareness, these problems start to vanish. Now, what's he going to do after this? Well, he wants to take this discussion and now move it back into moral philosophy and still try to answer what exactly is this moral philosophy? What is it? Stay tuned.